Okay, well, why don't we open to the book of Revelation, chapter 2. Let me ask again, some have come along in the last couple of weeks, how many of you have not, and it's okay to raise your hand, how many of you have not done a study in the book of Revelation previously? Good, a pretty fair number actually. This is good. It's really good for us to spend time going through it together because this is an often skipped book because there are things in there that sometimes can be confusing to understand. It seems because it's apocalyptic in nature, a lot of churches actually don't typically teach it because a lot of times people don't want to really take a position or a stance on some of the things that come up in it. And so I say that not because I don't also kind of study through these things and try and do my best to figure out the right place to land on a couple of these things. But I think it's important that we do study it. As we've said before, prophecy makes up about a third of the Scripture. Not all of it end times prophecy, but prophecy as a topic takes up about a third of the Bible. And some of that is, in fact, end times in nature, last things in nature, eschatological in nature is the big 25-cent college word for that. But the idea here is that God has put into His Word this topic not to confuse, but to encourage, to help us to look with anticipation. Matter of fact, even the letters we're reading through right now, which, kind of precedes all the quote-unquote exciting stuff that comes later with all the wrath and everything. But I would suggest that this part of the book is extremely important for us, especially as believers, if for no other reason than it was intended by Jesus, who dictated those letters to these churches to instruct, to encourage, to correct, to help them deal with the circumstances that they immediately were going through or would be going through shortly, as we'll see today. And so it's good for us. We don't want to neglect something that God has given us, not only in such large proportion in the Bible, but also as a gift, something that we should take time to try and understand. And so we do. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and open up to Revelation chapter 2. At the end of our Revelation studies, I try to give a little space at the end. I probably shouldn't warn you about this. I should catch you off guard instead. But I try to leave a little time at the end for anybody who might have a question about anything we talked about or covering. The reason I should wait till the end is because you're less likely to have one if you just know it's sprung on you at the sec. But now you've got the whole study to prepare. So, but anyway, so I'll try to do that at the end here as well. This is a shorter letter among the 7 that Jesus dictated, but it's profoundly rich. And I was reminded of that as I spent even more time going through it this week. And so that being said, let me go ahead and read the letter starting in verse 8. We're going to look at the letter to the church in Smyrna today. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those, or the blasphemy of those, who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. We mentioned, as we began our look at the letters last time, that there are some elements that are consistent throughout the letters. For starters, Jesus speaks of to the angel, and as we've said, the angel could speak of a literal spiritual being as we think of angels, as the word is often used to describe, that has some kind of particular influence over that church. Or, as the tack I tend to take is also a common view, is that the angel speaks of the messenger or the pastor or the leader of that church. In this particular church, that becomes kind of poignant in a way we'll talk about. But Jesus is dictating a letter to a church, and he is doing so probably through the means of the pastor of that church. He also introduces himself in a particular way, utilizing certain kinds of imagery as he does. He speaks about how he knows what's going on in the church, which is comforting to know that the Lord who walks among the lampstands, the candlesticks, the churches, he is aware of what's going on, and he is actively aware of what's going on. He then sometimes points out commendations and sometimes condemnations, or in a couple of examples, one or the other and not both. And we'll see those as we make our way through the letters. He gives some instruction or some encouragement, an admonition, And then he begins to close with words like, to he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who conquers is also included in the letters, and he speaks to that. And so these are elements that are consistent throughout the letters. So you'll see that through each, which means that Jesus has something to say to those churches, and typically he's got sort of the same kinds of categories with which to speak to each church. He introduces himself particular to that church. He gives admonition particular to that church. He who conquers within that church. Something specific is typically named. So that being said, kind of laid that out. What about Smyrna itself? There's some value in understanding the background of the city. Smyrna, or as its root would indicate, the word Smyrna comes from a root that comes the same word that we get the word myrrh from. It's easy to see. But myrrh is a fragrant kind of an element that when crushed, effuses its fragrance in that. And so there's something to be said about how Jesus approaches speaking to this church. That kind of is an undertone to it. But Smyrna was a port city, a trade city that was really second only to Ephesus. As a matter of fact, Smyrna outlived Ephesus in terms and surpassed Ephesus in terms of its trade, its value in that region of the world. That region of the world, again, being Asia Minor, or as we today would typically call it, Turkey, in that area. But as Smyrna continues to grow in influence as a trade city, it continues on that way. And as a matter of fact, today, it still exists under a different name. Izmir is, I think, how you pronounce it, but it is a city that still exists today. At the time that Jesus was dictating this letter and John was recording it, and the events that were going on around it, Smyrna was also deeply rooted and steeped in idolatry and false worship. The goddess Roma, who is a female deity that represented the Roman people and the Roman way of religious thinking in that, was personified with a temple to her. Also, Tiberius Caesar. Smyrna had a tremendous history of loyalty to Rome and to her practices and beliefs. So much so that when various cities in the area were competing to have the right to build like the premier temple to Tiberius Caesar, Smyrna won because of their devotion. And so the temple to Tiberius was built there as well. And so this cult of the Roman emperor worship was perpetuated in a pretty strong way in that city. I say all that to say that the believers in Smyrna were subject to living in a society and a culture that was steeped deeply rooted in pagan worship, in idolatry of various forms. And this is true of a lot of the churches of that day under the Roman Empire, but it is particularly poignant in a city like Smyrna, where they full-throatedly embraced it. Today, for example, by way of some comparison, there are things that we do in our society because we have to, but we don't really want to. Can you think of anything? There are some of those kinds of things. Well, in Smyrna, they were all in on this whole idea of worshiping Caesar and the various gods and goddesses and stuff of their particular pantheon. Zeus also having a temple there in that. Well, in that setting, Jesus sends a letter to this church. And he says to the angel of the church at Smyrna. Now, I mentioned before that there is something kind of poignant about this particular messenger over the church in Smyrna. It was a man by the name of Polycarp. How many of you are familiar with that name? Polycarp was a direct disciple of John the Apostle. He's somebody who knew the author of this letter, or the author of the book of Revelation, the author of the gospel. Polycarp, tradition holds, was appointed by John personally to be the bishop of that church in Smyrna. Polycarp was a very, very solid believer. As a matter of fact, the little bit of writing that we know about him, one of those things has to do with his martyrdom, written about him. And it details his compulsion to follow Christ in the face of being taken away to his execution in that. The idea that, of course, like anyone else, he would sort of, hide himself as far as he could like anyone would. But ultimately, when that became no longer a thing, he didn't cower, but rather he very openly and willingly went with the soldiers when they arrested him, ultimately to lead him to his not crucifixion, but his martyrdom, which took place, is that me here? Which took place, I think, in about 155 A.D. And he said this, when he was ultimately about to die, what was the typical Roman practice is that as Christians would be brought forth to be executed, they would give them an opportunity to denounce their faith, to reject Jesus, bring a pinch of incense and put it into this flame to be offered up to the various gods and Caesar and such. And some professing or professed Christians would do that and such. Many would not. And Polycarp in particular would not. And here's what he had to say when his time came. 66 years I have been his servant, and he hath done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And with boldness he went ahead and gave his life ultimately for the name of Christ. The little bit that we know from his own writing and written about him in that, we know that he was somebody that the church of that time, and in particular in Smyrna, was able to look to as an example, a sterling example of what it meant to be devoted and to follow Christ. Now, I make such a point of that because the kind of persecution that they were experiencing and would experience, as we read and we'll talk about, required a strong leader who set an example in the face of persecution. And Polycarp was one such person. So, let's look into what the letter says. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. This is Jesus' introduction of himself to these believers. First off, the words of him. You know, you can imagine how... we can imagine in some places in the world where churches, believers within those churches are persecuted greatly. We can imagine it, think about what it might be like. We don't really know it unless you come from a place like that. But we can sort of imagine from what we've read, what we've seen, maybe movies we've seen of this kind of thing, reports from missionaries, what kind of suffering and difficulty some around the world go through and what they might have gone through by comparison. And so to receive a word directly from Jesus in that context would have meant the world to them. Jesus, the Lord, the one that we are serving and sacrificing for, the one we love and one day so desperately long to see, has a word for us in the midst of our suffering. Now, you and I don't hear a word like a letter like this, for example, today from Jesus, but nonetheless we have his word. And we too find comfort in those moments that we read it in difficult times and that. But you can imagine when John, or the messenger who brought this book of Revelation to each of the churches, and they saw that Jesus had written to them, what that might have meant to them. Those who were living in a bad way certainly would be a little intimidated by what Jesus might have to say, but those who knew that they were living for him with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength, when they would get a word from the Lord, you can imagine how they must have been just relieved to know that Jesus would say something like, I know what you're going through. Wow. So the words of him, the sweet sound of our Savior's words to them. Now, he refers to himself as the first and the last, the one who died and came to life. The first and the last, other terms are similar to this, we see, referred to of Jesus and also of the Father as well, the Alpha and the Omega and such. The idea of the first and the last, or I found myself kind of comparing it in a way to something that the author to the Hebrews said when he spoke of Jesus as the author and finisher of our faith. The idea that he is the all-encompassing one. He's the one who's at the very beginning. He's the one who's at is there at the end and such. He is our all in every way. He's also the one who died and who came back to life. This probably is a very direct response to a particular kind of heresy and false teaching that was going around at the time. We typically refer it to Gnosticism, but Docetism is what it's actually called. The idea that Jesus did not come physically in the body, but rather was something of a phantom or had some kind of real but not material substance. Well, how does that affect the gospel? Well, if Jesus did not come physically, that means he did not die physically and rise from the dead as the gospel requires and as the gospel is presented. So for Jesus to say, I died and I came back to life, is a very particular statement to make, considering the kind of thing that was permeating much of the belief of the ancient world in regard to Jesus. And so he is the one who debunks these false ideas, but rather he is the one who literally came into the world in the incarnation. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. It's interesting that it's John who is called to write the Apocalypse, and he talks about things like this. It's John who speaks about the Word being with God and being God and walking and entering into the world, taking on flesh. And then after the resurrection, it is John who talks about how we touched him with our hands, we heard him with our ears, we saw him with our eyes concerning the word of life. The Christian faith is rooted and built upon, as Paul would say, the fact that according to the Scriptures, Jesus died, was buried, and rose again. And then, of course, he goes on to describe the many witnesses to his resurrection afterward. This is important. This is necessary, and Jesus addresses this church this way. Now, another reason he addresses this church this way is because some of them would be martyred. They'd be faced with death. They would find themselves being brought before magistrates and ultimately being condemned to die. As a matter of fact, when he talks about some of them being put into prison, prison is a form of punishment, but prison for a Christian meant that you were basically waiting for your time to die. It wasn't like you're waiting to get out. You're waiting for your time to die. And so while you were in prison, that's what you were waiting for. Some of them would be in such a circumstance. And so the one who died and came back to life. And again he says, I know. I know your tribulation and your poverty and the slander or blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not but of the synagogue of Satan. I know your tribulation. The word tribulation speaks of being pressured, crushed. Again, the idea of myrrh ultimately not really reaching the climax of its existence until it is pressed and crushed, and then it diffuses this fragrance. I also find it interesting that Jesus himself, myrrh is associated with him. At his earliest years, as the Magi brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but also in his burial anointing. These believers and the pressure they were going to go under and were going under, ultimately in some sense was similar to the kind of fragrance of Jesus' own suffering. There was an identity there, identifying. There's comfort in those words, that even though you're going to face what you're going to face, Jesus knows it and he values it and he uses it for glory. But I know your tribulation. He says, I also know your poverty. Now this may speak of they're being plundered as Christians. It may speak of that kind of a thing. But he says, by contrast, you're rich. You're actually rich. When you're in a circumstance where your very life is threatened for your faith, I have to believe that it puts things into a perspective that few other things can. If you knew that tomorrow was your last day, that would cause you to prioritize things a certain way. Some things would cease to be important anymore. Other things would take on a whole new depth of importance. For these believers, in the face of such persecution, of such pressuring and crushing, they may appear in poverty in one sense, in a very real, physical, practical kind of a sense. It may also refer to the smallness of their gathering. We're not sure. But in some way, they are not seen as having much in the eyes of the world, or maybe even in their own eyes in some sense. But Jesus encourages them and says, but you're actually rich. What does he mean by such a thing? Well, let me invite you to turn to something that Paul actually had to say in 2 Corinthians. I think this says it better than I could. It's the word. Of course it says it better than I could, right? But 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And in particular, just verses 8 through 10, and 10 in particular. Paul is talking about their own difficulties and sufferings. But I'll just pick it up here in verse 8, where in the midst of this he goes on and says, through honor and dishonor, through slander and praise, we are treated as impostors, yet we are true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying, and behold we live, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing yet possessing everything. Paul is an example of what we're talking about. Is somebody who lived constantly under threat of death, under threat of arrest, under threat of beatings, all those kinds of things. And as such, he didn't have much to his name. He was itinerant. He was always on the move. He worked in order to provide for himself. Other times people helped him out and that kind of thing, but he did not have a lot of things, much like the Lord himself, who, when he was crucified, the only thing he really had were the clothes on his back. And yet, in the midst of this, Paul says, as seemingly having nothing, but in reality, having everything. In other words, everything that matters. Again, priority. Jesus is speaking to a church here back in Revelation chapter 2, as a church who he's encouraging to recognize that in this moment, in this hour of trial, they have what matters. They have what is important. As a matter of fact, he will talk about the rewards that come with hanging in there, ultimately through the persecutions in that. They are not a church that is enamored with the world around them because they can't afford to be. There's too much happening to them right now. And they need to hang on to something that will uphold them, and that's what Jesus is speaking to. So in fact, they are rich. One commentator said, the gold that the Laodiceans lacked, that gold refined in the fire that the Laodiceans lacked, those in Smyrna had. He also says, I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. This is an interesting idea, an interesting passage. Some commentators use this passage as well as Paul's words, and let's turn to them actually, in Romans chapter 9. There are commentators that will use these words along again with those words that Paul shares in Romans chapter 9. And I'll just read verses 6 to 8. I always encourage you to read the whole passage and get the whole context. In this case, that would be, as a set, verses chapters 9 through 11. But for our purposes this morning, Paul says in chapter 9, verse 6 of Romans, but it is not as though the word of God has failed, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, and not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring, but through Isaac shall your offspring be named. This means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. And so Paul is making a case here that he actually continues throughout these chapters. He's actually making 2 points with a central idea at the heart. There's two arguments he's making on 2 different subjects, but in regard to this topic, there's sort of 2 ideas at play. One is at the heart of them both. The idea of what does it mean to truly be a Jew? Now, I want you to hear me out on this, because as any of you know who have been listening to me ever talk about this subject, you know I have a very, very strong view of God's view of Israel. Spoiler alert, it's pro. And so, but what Paul is talking about here is the idea that there is such a thing as ethnic Israel. Matter of fact, the section starts with Paul saying, I wish it were possible for me to even give my own salvation for my kinsmen according to the flesh. He'd be willing to go to hell for his fellow Jews if it meant they could be saved. That's his care and love and concern for his ethnic brothers and sisters, his national brothers and sisters. However, in the very early parts of his discussion about God's dealing with the nation of Israel, he makes a really important point for us, but it's one that I think sometimes gets abused. He makes the point that ultimately, somebody who is true Israel, if you will, is someone who believes the promises of God by faith. You're not born into it per se. In one sense, in terms of salvation, no one's born into it. You're born again into it, right? But there is something particular about ethnic Israel that I'll talk to in a moment. But Paul is saying that just because somebody is Jewish does not mean that they are children of God necessarily. In other words, it is possible to be an ethnic Jew and not be saved. As a matter of fact, right now, that tends to be the majority and has been for a long time. Why? Because they have rejected Jesus, the one who was sent first to them and will come back again in large part for them. Right? I want to start kind of laying some foundations for some of this thinking. When I say that sometimes the view of God's dealing with Israel has been abused by verses like this, or like what Jesus says in Revelation 2, which we've not left, we're going to come back to. Generally speaking, one of those abuses takes on the label of replacement theology. The idea that when Israel rejected Jesus, the promises that were made to her were forfeited and embraced now by the church, or given to the church. Unfortunately, that view does not take into account some extremely important foundations for the covenant that God made with Israel and the promises he made to them. We are familiar in Genesis chapter 12 when God calls Abraham and tells him that he will make him a great nation, right? Abraham believes this promise of God, and by faith now, he receives that promise. But there's another thing, another element to confirming that promise that we also want to make sure we're familiar with. In Genesis chapter 15, God kind of reconfirms this promise to Abraham in a very kind of an odd way from our understanding of things, our Western thinking, or what we generally would think is involved in confirming a covenant. But in the Middle East, it would not be uncommon if you were going to make a covenant that was really important. What you would do is you would take in this particular case, as prescribed, there was a certain number of animals that were laid sort of in a line. They were divided lengthwise down the middle and separated and put to two sides, the blood running in between and all of that. The two parties in that covenant would then walk through those two animal halves, through the blood. Sounds pretty gross, right? All the kids are getting a kick out of this. But the idea that the two parties would walk through that, and the basic implication was, may this happen to me if I don't keep my end of the covenant. Okay? It was a very serious thing. As a matter of fact, how many of you have ever worn one of those little mitzvah pendants? You know, the Lord watch over us while we're apart, this wonderful thing. You know, like guys give it to their girlfriends and all this kind of thing. There's a principle that, it's not the same event, but there's a principle there that sort of is similar. That was Laban and Jacob, and Laban said to Jacob, look, you lying, cheating conniver, I'm going to come get you. Let God get you if you break this covenant we're making, and that kind of thing. It's actually not very touching and emotional. It's actually kind of like, watch it, dude, you're going to get it. So if your girlfriend gives that to you, boys. But anyway, the principle being that the covenant was important. Getting back to Genesis 15. When God calls Abraham aside and he tells Abraham to get these animals together, and Abraham sets these animals up like you would make the covenant. Actually, I don't recall if Abraham did it or if God set it up, but it was set up in order to make this covenant. However, God put Abraham into a deep sleep at that moment, and only God walked through them. Meaning what? Anybody? Right. It was not Abraham's responsibility to keep the covenant. It was God's. In other words, this covenant, whether it stood or failed, was based on God's faithfulness and not at all on Abraham's. That's a gigantic thing to recognize when we talk about God's covenant and his covenantal love for his chosen people. As a matter of fact, this becomes a part of Paul's argument in Romans 9 through 11 when he says, look, the calling and promises of God are irrevocable, right? These things were given to them by God, and he will uphold them. Now, in one sense, you and I as Gentiles have been grafted onto this vine that is Israel, okay? We've been brought into an element of this covenant. We're part of it now. We've been brought in, but it's not our covenant that we've been brought into. We are beneficiaries of something that God did with his chosen people. As a matter of fact, Paul at one point says, look, don't get arrogant about this. Don't think that you're the vine, or somehow don't get cocky about this, because if God didn't or isn't going to bring them back onto it, then you shouldn't feel too confident about you staying part of it. In other words, if he cuts them loose, he's going to cut you loose too. In other words, God keeps his promises. So what's going on now? Well, let me make this statement before we come back too. But the idea that Paul could speak to those who are not believing by faith are not true Jews, in his argument there, is true, and God's faithfulness to keep his promises to national ethnic Israel can also be true at the same time. In other words, there are two distinctly dealt with bodies of people in biblical theology. There are his chosen people, and there's everybody else who comes by faith. And of course, there are those who don't come. But in regard to his faithfulness, to his covenants, to his promises, to salvation, and then ultimately to his faithfulness to Israel, we cannot blur the lines of those things, because if we do, we misunderstand the millennial kingdom, we misunderstand a lot of things. And so, as a matter of fact, when Jesus comes to institute his millennial kingdom, when he sets it up, we rejoice and are excited about it. But first and foremost, that millennial kingdom is a fulfillment of the promises that God made to his covenantal, ethnic, national, the Jews, Israel. And so therefore, this is theirs first, and we also benefit from this ultimate fulfillment. It's a wonderfully rich study in itself. But it's important for what we're talking about today, back in Revelation chapter 2, because this passage does not in any way negate the promises that God made to Israel, but it does make an important point that we don't want to be soft on either. It is fascinating and, frankly, a little disturbing that God calls those who are in fact ethnically Jewish but are not receiving the promises made to Israel and are even going as far as persecuting those who did. Jesus refers to them as the synagogue of Satan. Much in the same way, if you remember when Jesus himself was in an exchange with the Pharisees, and they were accusing him of being illegitimately born. In other words, word of his miraculous birth was known at least in some quarters, but the Pharisees weren't buying it. Your mother was unfaithful, and that's what you're a product of, is what they're saying. Harsh words. Topped only by the harsher words that Jesus says, well, you're of your father, the devil. Not going to win a lot of friends and influence people with that one, right? But Jesus responds to them, and in making that statement is it's sort of an echo of what we're reading right now. They are ethnically Jewish. These were the religious leaders, right? Back in the gospel. But Jesus points out that it is possible, even as an ethnic Jew, to have a different father than the actual Father God. And the Pharisees were among those. Why? Because they were rejecting him. They were refusing him. They were resisting him, and they were trying to lead others away. As a matter of fact, one of the things Jesus talked about in his in the woes that he lays out upon the Pharisees is, you bring a proselyte, you make a convert, but you make him twice as son of hell as yourself. Harsh condemnation, right? But the point at the heart of that is this point. There are those who say they are Jews, and they ethnically may be. I don't think he's referring to someone else who's not. But even though they are ethnically Jewish, they are not truly of the spirit of Israel, like Paul would talk about back in Romans chapter 9, but rather they have rejected and are even persecuting. Paul himself would deal with this throughout his own ministry with the Judaizers who would come. Again, I'm getting a little off the subject, but in Acts chapter 15, we have the first council in the church, and they dealt with the issue, does a Gentile need to come through Moses to come to Christ? And the answer was no. And the next question was the logical one. Well, then what of the law? Is it no longer in effect? Do we no longer have to follow it? Again, the answer was no. We come by faith. Now, Paul would go on to explain the purpose of the law in Galatians 3 when he talked about it as a schoolmaster, sort of a means to keep us walking down the straight line, ultimately leading us to Christ. But the idea of the law, even as being seen as a means of righteousness that could be achieved, well, much of the book of Romans is about that very thing, as is Galatians and such. And so to make that statement is not only permissible biblically, but it's at the heart of what Jesus may be talking about here in Revelation chapter 2, among those who say they are Jews but are not. but instead are a synagogue of Satan, or of the adversary, right? And so, if you have questions about that, we'll save them to the end, by the way. But so he goes on, and he says that he goes on to commend or to instruct them, to encourage them. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Back in Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Now, he talks about their tribulation they're experiencing, but he goes on to say there is still more to come. And notice what he says here. It's interesting. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Now, Jesus talks about the synagogue of Satan here. He also talks about a place where the devil dwells, and the church of Pergamum and that kind of thing. But this is the only time in the letters that he talks about how the devil is going to put some of you in jail. Now, I'm not going to read too much into that and say that I know for sure what he's saying is that Satan himself has his eye on this church, but he might. Okay? He doesn't say that to the other churches. He doesn't seem to be speaking in general terms. So I'm open to the possibility that the faithfulness of this church has caught Satan's eye. And he's going to ultimately come to them with further and deeper and harsher persecution. And Jesus starts off by saying, don't fear that. Don't fear that that's coming. Wow. The devil himself, I don't have to be afraid. Well, in my own strength I do. I should be terrified. But not behind Jesus. Not behind the one at whom even the devil shudders, who is subject to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so therefore, if we're going to be fearless, we need to be behind the one that we know can defend us and stand before us. That's a strong encouragement to them. Don't be afraid, even though Satan himself, if that is what he is saying, is going to ultimately throw some of you into prison. Now, of course, in a sense, in the sense that evil is going to prevail, some of you as believers are going to be arrested and all that. I've often said that, when it comes to the devil himself, he's probably not personally harassing you and I. There might be a few bigger fish to fry than people like us. But that doesn't mean that he's not actively, he went after Job, right? We should never think that he may not, if a church is faithful, from time to time, set his gaze upon that fellowship and seek to undermine it. I don't hope for that. I think it's a misguided bravado to ask Satan to bring it on, Now, even Michael the archangel said, "The Lord rebuke you," when he was disputing with Satan about the body of Moses. Michael the archangel, my understanding of him is he's a pretty big hitter. But even he had the wherewithal to recognize that really it was the Lord that would stand as the one to rebuke Satan. And so, but Jesus says, don't be afraid of this. As a matter of fact, what Satan will mean for evil, Jesus sees as a tool to build something good. Notice what he says here. He's going to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested. The idea of being tested means to be tempered, to be proved, to be tried. If you ever remember those commercials for the Marine Corps, when you'd have like the steel in that forge and they'd hammer it out and they'd make this sword out of it, and all of a sudden, there it is, and it's just this impressive thing. Well, it became that thing because it went through the forge, because it went through the heat, because it got hammered for a while, because it got beaten down until it became this tool. Well, God sees our testings as just that. As his children, he does allow very difficult things into our lives. Some of you know this very well. But these things are not meant to destroy. They're meant to prove, to temper, to build, to strengthen. And so he says, don't be afraid. Satan's going to do this to you, but it's so that you'll be tested. And he goes on and even says, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Now some see the 10 days as maybe speaking of sort of a figurative thing. It's like maybe it speaks of, matter of fact, some have said that this speaks of 10 different ages of persecution under 10 different Roman emperors, starting with Nero and ending with Diocletian, I think it was, but like 10 emperors in a row that for periods of time would persecute the church. And so is Jesus speaking to that kind of an idea? I don't think there's a reason to have to think that. Remember, Jesus is talking first and foremost, before anything else, he's talking to these believers. And so he's not spiritualizing things. There may have very well been a period of time that is finite, and I think that is really the point, is that there's a period of time that's coming that is going to be exceedingly difficult, but it's finite. Why? Because it's intended for testing and proving. It's not your end. I don't think the other thing is really what's in view, but who knows? But I tend to think it's much more simple than that. This is a good word, by the way, in really rough times. Remember, this is what they're in and what they're going to be experiencing, but it's meant to be an encouragement to them. There is no condemnation in this entire letter. I don't know if you noticed that as we read through it, as we've been talking about it. At no point does Jesus fix something in this church. He doesn't say this is wrong. Nevertheless, I have this against you. There's none of that. It's just commendation, at the very least, by virtue of having no condemnation. In other words, you guys are doing this well. Hang in there. Continue on. Press forward. Peter, in terms of testing and going through trials, matter of fact, turn to 1 Peter chapter 1. I'd like for these passages to I'd like us to see the passages. I'd like us to read them, underline them, highlight them, memorize them. But in chapter 1, in verse 3, he begins by talking about how blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he's caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being kept through faith for salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. And in this you rejoice, even though now, for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the testing of your faith, or the tested genuineness of your faith, which is more precious than gold that perishes, though it's tested by fire, may be found to the resulting praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. The idea of these sufferings are intended to ultimately bring about glory to God, but it's ultimately also intended to build us and strengthen us, and it is seen as a beautiful thing. And notice he says, if necessary. It also can be a necessary thing. Now, none of us like to think of trials as necessary. We like to think of them as things to be avoided. We don't always see them as having purpose until we're in them. And then we're forced to wonder, and as we try to reconcile why God would let this happen to us or something like that, we eventually, if we spend time bringing it to the Lord like we should, eventually he helps us to understand that he is using that circumstance for a purpose, not only for us. We'd like to think that's the pinnacles, that God is teaching us something or using it for something in our lives. That is true. But there is a greater purpose in it, and that is his glory. In other words, my sufferings can be an act of worship for him. Now, I love him. That doesn't mean I'm sadistically wanting trials and hardships, but it puts those things into a context that I'm okay with. I understand what can come from them, the beauty that can ultimately come, the fragrance that can be effused or diffused as I'm crushed under the weight of a trial in the same way they were. It actually turns out to be an act of worship. He says you'll have, back in Revelation chapter 2, as we'll kind of bring this in for a landing here, you'll be tested for 10 days, and you will have tribulation. That's twice he's spoken about it in the letter so far. But he encourages them, as he brings the letter to a close, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Be faithful unto death. Which likely for them did not mean be faithful for the next 30, 40 years until you grow old and die. Be faithful until they kill you. Up to the end. Be faithful up to the end. What does it mean to be faithful to him? It means not to deny him. It means not to bend a knee to the gods of this age. even though it will cost us something. It's hard for me to speak about our cost as Christians. Even what may come down the road may begin to look more like what they experienced. But now is the time to think about those things. What's the old adage? When did Noah build the ark? Before the rain, right? So it's like there's some preparation involved before we get to those places. But the idea of faithfulness is a choice we make. I'm yours. I was bought at a price. Therefore, I will decide now to glorify God with my body. It's a choice I'm making. To bless him, to honor him, to not turn on him. God forbid in a moment of weakness I do. It doesn't mean he doesn't love me anymore. It just means I failed in that moment. But I don't want to fail in that moment. I want to be faithful. And that's his call to me. That's his call to you. It was his call to them. It was his encouragement to them. And he says, be faithful to the end, and I'll give you the crown of life. As many of you know, there are a couple of words that are used to speak of the idea of a crown in the New Testament. One is a crown that a king would wear, a monarch, a ruler. That's where we get our word diadem from. The other one is a crown that is given to somebody who wins a competition. Somebody who in the Olympic Games would get that laurel wreath. The Greek word is stephanos. It speaks of the fact that you endured to the end and you won. That's why Paul uses analogies like this, running the race with endurance and such, running the race. I beat my body so that I won't be disqualified, things like this. I want to press on through. I want to win this thing. Not that I'm competing with you, but I'm pressing on, wanting to cross that finish line. Like Paul would say, right? I have fought the fight. I have kept my course. I have kept the faith, as he told this to Timothy before he ultimately would be martyred. We want to say that. There is a crown awaiting. There is a reward waiting. Your labors, your effort, your strain, your struggle is something that God sees and encourages you to press on. There is a result at the end that is worth it, is what's in view. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say here that he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Again, the call to the individual, those who will hear these words. But he finishes by saying the one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Okay? Will not be hurt by the second death. The first death is when you and I just pass. We die, whether it's through old age or martyrdom or whatever it might be. That's the first death, just natural death. The second death is judgment. As a matter of fact, turn to Revelation chapter 20 for a moment. My great hope, I promise you I'm not going to stall to make it happen, but my great hope is that the Lord will come back before we actually get here. But in verse 11 of chapter 20, John records what he sees. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. And then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. And then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And everyone's name who was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. This is what we would consider hell. This is now the final destination, second death, of those who in rejection of Christ now receive the recompense for their works. But a believer is spared that. He who overcomes is spared that. That is not what awaits the child of God. Now, you'll notice from the passage in 1 Peter, there's a phrase there that I always emphasize when I'm reading and had to bite my tongue not to stop and spend a lot of time in it in the moment, because I'll spend a moment on it now. This reward in heaven that is kept for you who are kept by what? The power of God for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. When you read passages like that, or we're probably all familiar with Paul's golden chain of redemption, whom he foreknew ultimately results in being glorified, right? It finishes the process. Philippians chapter 1, that which he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it until the day of Christ. Ephesians 1:13, you're sealed with the Holy Spirit, right? In other words, that redemption, that's going to happen now because you're his. As a child of God, Jesus, of all that the Father has given me, I will lose none. No one can snatch them out of my hands or out of my Father's hands. It almost couldn't be more obvious, plain, simple, straightforward. There is no losing that which God has given you. You're kept. You're His. Will you fail? Will you stumble? Yes. Can you lose that which God has not only given you, but has promised that you will receive once you have? No. There's no losing that. To him who overcomes, the believer will overcome. Okay? And because of that, because you are one of those, you and I will not face the second death. In other words, there is no judgment like that for you and I. Well, to a group of believers in Smyrna who are being crushed for their faith and who are about to be even persecuted in a more harsh fashion, the word that if you just hang in there until it's going to come to an end. There's a finiteness to this period of time you're in right now. One day it'll be over and you'll be with Him. And you have no need to fear that you won't. He is there waiting for you at the end of this trial, at the end of this road, at the end of this race. We said as we started the letters that there's a number of ways we can interpret these letters. One is the obvious initial. They're written to these churches. But we also talked about how there's clearly an application for you and I in these things. We understand the principles that underlie what Jesus is saying, and we can apply certain things in our understanding of them in terms of their theological import, in that we understand that these things also have something to say to us. And the same truths that were true of those believers in the first century in regard to their salvation and their call to endure to the end. That's a word for you and I as well, especially as we get closer and closer and closer to those last final moments before Jesus comes for us and then ultimately establishes His kingdom. And then after that brings the very judgment we just spoke about.